Hello, everybody. I'm so glad you're here. I'm going to call this session together. I am Tony Falbo, who is now the interim graduate advisor for the Department of Educational Psychology, and my pronouns are she, her, and hers. That is the first time I've had in my whole life, and I've been alive a long time, that I've had a chance to say that. So please, understand I'm just happy that I could participate in this important movement. So I'm here to not talk about my pronouns, but to talk about our guest speaker today, Cindy Karlsen. She has been a leader in school psychology for many, many decades, and has been active in the school psychology program here in the Department of Educational Psychology. Her work about family matters and family psychology definitely is an important part of the school psychology training. And our school psychology program was, I think, the first school psychology program. So we have the original school psychology program here in the Department of Educational Psychology. So she recently was chair of the Department of Educational Psychology for many years, but has stepped down from that now. And without too much more ado, I will let you listen to her talk to us about family matters.
Thank you, Tony. Thank you, students and faculty. It's a pleasure to have this opportunity. I'm going to start by asking you to think about February 2018, or 2019, excuse me. You probably weren't particularly aware of this, but this is about the time every year when the Academy Awards are given. I'm sure this was central and foremost on your radar, and you were paying a lot of attention to it. The reason I'm bringing it up here is, of course, no matter what you were listening to, and I'm an NPR addict, there was information, advertisements, commentary, discussion about who is going to win the Academy Awards. It's just part of, entertainment, all things considered. And I was listening to Terry Gross on Fresh Air interview a potential Academy Award winner. I think maybe for Best Actor, I'm not sure. It was definitely a male. And in that interview, she says, well, if you win, have you thought about your acceptance speech and what you're going to say and who you're going to thank? So I wish to pause here and ask you each to consider the possibility that you won the top award in your field and you had to give an acceptance speech. In fact, I'm sure some of you have already won the top awards in your field. Who would you thank? Take just a minute, think of the 2, 3, 4, whoever you would thank. How many of you would thank your mother? How many of you would thank your father? How many of you would thank a spouse? How many of you would thank children? Interestingly, those were exactly the responses that this particular actor, maybe winner, I don't know whether he won or not, said. He paused and he said, well, of course there were many people that helped to make this movie possible, but I would really thank my mother, my father, my wife, and my 4 children. That's what this talk is about. This talk is about the fact that despite our many individual achievements and all of the effort that goes into them as individuals and the help of many others, peers, colleagues, other support systems and infrastructures, that interestingly, when it comes down to it, we tend to it's our close family or supportive relationships that in some way help us become who we are and we think of at those most important times. So today I wish to talk with you about the pervasive impact for better or worse, that our family relationships have on our life. I'll emphasize the role that family processes play in children's school success because that has been the emphasis of my teaching and scholarship, as well as the fact that we're in a college of education. But I'll also discuss the impact that family processes have on the mental and physical health of children, and a topic that's of growing interest to me, as well as the specialty of couple and family psychology, overall the impact that relationships have on our physical health, both as in children and in adults. My passion for the topic of family matters really began when I was a graduate student, like many of you. And for those of you who've already taken my class, you'll have to forgive me because you've heard this story before. But since it set the stage for what was to come, it's important for me to share it with you again. Back in the late 70s or early 80s, one of my first practicums after my school practicums was with a community mental health center. There was great excitement at this time in the field, somewhat like trauma-informed care now, or motivational interviewing, or any number of things. But at this particular time, what was most exciting in the mental health field was family therapy. All of a sudden, we understood that the conceptual paradigm shift of systems theory had really shifted things from thinking about individuals to individuals within their larger social contexts. And the community mental health practicum where I was no exception to this. Led by a psychiatrist who had been trained by Salvador Minuchin, a key father figure in family therapy and the head of the person who developed structural family therapy. My supervisor was well versed in this way of thinking. So my first case, which was a referral from the schools, regarded a boy in elementary school who had been continually struggling academically and in his classroom behavior for 3 years. Despite the fact that there were excellent special education services, despite the fact that there were successful ARD meetings, and a number of different interventions had been tried. Like any good school psychology student, I first spoke with the parents, spoke with the teacher, conducted a classroom observation, reviewed the test or assessment that had been conducted on this child to see if there was anything else I could figure out to do. For better or worse, the classroom teacher couldn't have been a better teacher. The school system couldn't have been it was a university school system. It couldn't have been better prepared to deal with the needs of this particular student. So, while explaining this case to my practicum supervisor, who politely listened to me go through this process, he sat back and asked, "Who's in the family?" You might think this is a logical question and an easy one to answer. Schools, I knew that the boy had a mother. That's who I had been dealing with. That's who the school had been dealing with. Schools, after all, must get consent to do testing and to do any kind of intervention. My supervisor, however, was not in the least bit impressed with my answer. And he asked, "Who else is in the family?" I didn't know. First of all, I thought no one else was in the family except this mother and child. But, like any good student, I went back to the mother and talked with her about this situation. I learned that this mother lived with her mother and father. They were somewhat elderly. Her father was ill. This single mother, was neither employed. She had no driver's license. She had no occupation. I can't remember right now. She may not have graduated yet from high school. She was highly dependent upon her parents. My supervisor, when hearing about this, basically, he listened politely again, and he basically handed me Salvador Minuchin's classic text, Families and Family Therapy, and sent me off for another week before the next supervision. This book, for me, was an eye-opener. I discovered the possibility that this child, that despite appreciation for genetic endowments that were contributing to the challenges he was having in the classroom, that from the perspective of this book, it was possible that there were family processes that were exacerbating his difficulties. From the classic structural family therapy perspective, this was a case of trigenerational enmeshment and a lack of a clear parental hierarchy, such that, which is hypothesized to contribute to children's internalizing and externalizing problems. Regardless of whether the validity of that particular hypothesis, when I began considering this possibility, I started working with the mother and the child together to empower this mother, which often means helping with parenting techniques, but empowering this mother to gain agency, not only with her child, but with the school, and develop agency vis-a-vis her family, such that she eventually got a driver's license, started a nursing program, eventually moved out, and eventually we established, worked with her son to put him in a Big Brothers program to help facilitate additional support for her and the family. I managed over the next year in my internship that involved rotations at the Memphis City Schools to take every one of my child assessment cases and make it a family therapy case. Needless to say, I had swallowed the sort of magic pill regarding this. And interestingly, every case, of course, when you're on internship, they give you very complicated cases, so I'm not saying that every case needs this. But every case managed to benefit from having a larger or a broader family systems approach to considering the challenges that children were having in schools. This particular experience and the subsequent internship experiences really laid the foundation for me to become interested in and passionate about teaching school psychology students and other child psychologists to consider the possibility always that children thrive when they're in family relationships that are supportive, and that focus only on the child may not be considering fully the other relationships that can benefit this child or bring long-term support for the child over time. Of course, this is just a single, and so that's what I'll be talking about today. And by the end, I hope to convince you that family matters, and you should always consider it in your assessment and your intervention and your research going forward. Of course, I just explained to you or described to you a clinical case study. There was no data, so it was just clinical experience which informs our interest in scholarship and research, and vice versa. So let's see what the research says about this, about family matters and how it impacts children's school performance. I recently completed a chapter on families in schools that was published in the Handbook of Contemporary Family Psychology by APA in 2019. I want to acknowledge my student co-authors, former graduates, or now graduates, Danica Maddox and Chris Garmadalia, and wish to briefly review this literature with you, where we discussed the impact of family on children's school success. First of all, family is considered to be the most significant and pervasive influence on children's development, including their success and failure in school. Parents provide the emotional security that serves as the foundation of the child's relationship with self and others. This has been well documented and supported by attachment theory, which probably provides us with the strongest theoretical model for this. Parents and other family members serve as role models and regulators of emotion. Family members are teachers and conveyors of culture. Their attitudes towards education and schooling make a difference. Children do better in school when parents hold high educational aspirations and value education. Adult family members are providers of social and economic resources that impact educational quality and opportunity. Parents show their involvement and interest in valuing of education by being involved in their children's education, either in school or at home. Of course, home support can be according to Erica Patal, one of our former faculty members here in the College of Education, a little bit iffy, because if parents are involved at home in their children's education, it can also have negative impacts, meaning if parents express doubt about their children's ability, if they're controlling or critical with regard to their children's homework, or if getting children to do homework involves conflict, it can have a negative effect instead on children's success in school. So it's not all one-sided. It has, as with parenting, it has to be done with the right balance of support and care and sensitivity. In general, we know that positive family relationships support children's school performance, and maladaptive family processes make it difficult for children to succeed in school. Children have better academic engagement and performance when their families are warm, supportive, communicative, structured, and relatively free of conflict. In contrast, families that have conflict predict difficulty in school, as well as declines in grades and academic self-esteem. How does this happen exactly? At a fundamental level, biological parents contribute a child's genetic endowment that affects their intelligence, their risk for learning disabilities, attention problems, autism, mental health disorders, and other genetically influenced abilities. These can either enable or limit school success. But genes are not destiny. Development is epigenetic. Certain genes and the associated characteristics can be turned on or off, depending on responses to caregiving and other experiences. In this way, again, family processes play an important part in determining whether children develop the skills they need to be successful and happy in school. Starting in infancy, the parent-child relationship lays the child's biological foundation for school success. Infants and young children who experience consistent and sensitive caregiving are able to habituate to stressors and return to homeostasis more quickly through a process known as allostasis. In contrast, children who experience inconsistent or harsh caregiving are less able to return to homeostasis following a stressor. Allostatic load can accumulate over time, impair the body's stress response system, and increase vulnerability to cognitive deficits, mental health disorders, and other difficulties. Because infancy is such a critical period for neural organization, poor parental attunement and attachment during this time can have particularly long-lasting effects on children's neurobiology and school performance. Can lead to lower intelligence, poorer attention, difficulties with numeracy, weak executive functioning, all of which predict poor academic performance. Parents continue to affect children at a neurobiological level throughout development. Maltreatment, such as abuse or neglect, is an extreme example of parental dysfunction and is devastating to children's development. Children who are maltreated often experience long-lasting neurological and cognitive deficits in inhibitory control, working memory, language abilities, visual spatial functioning, and overall intelligence and executive functioning and motor skills. Clearly, these are all critical cognitive skills for children in school. Less extreme forms of family dysfunction can also cause biological and neurological changes that impair school performance. For example, unresponsive parenting, parent-child conflict, marital conflict, and chaotic family processes are related to irregular cortisol patterns, cognitive impairments, and poor executive functioning in children, all of which undermine their ability to regulate their behavior and their attention. Overall, positive family functioning may support children's school performance in part because it buffers the negative impacts of stress both within or outside the family, whatever the source. Overall, children who feel a sense of belonging with their family tend to experience less stress. which enables them to perform better academically. Recent reviews also find that positive family relationships protect children who live in poverty or high-stress environments from increased risk of neurological deficits. Positive family functioning protects children from difficulties following acute stressors such as separation, divorce, remarriage, parental illness, or death. Although these family changes are inherently stressful for children, 2/3 of children do not experience significant or long-lasting difficulties as long as family relation or parent-child relationships remain positive and supportive. Among African American adolescents, families with positive racial socialization and frequent parent-adolescent communication protect youth from the harmful effects of discrimination. A strong sense of family obligation among Mexican American adolescents is related to more mature neurological processing and lower rates of engagement in risky adolescent behavior or association with deviant groups that are likely to affect school engagement and completion. Family effects accumulate and unfold over time, so longitudinal studies of these effects are particularly helpful and informative. Children who experience less sensitive parenting or live in chaotic households during early childhood have poor executive functioning and self-regulation in kindergarten when they first attend school, and tend to have more behavioral and conduct problems and referrals. Family interaction patterns in kindergarten predict teacher reports of child academic competence, as well as internalizing and externalizing difficulties in the 9th grade. One of my research heroes, Gerald Patterson from the Oregon Social Learning Center, and one of his students, Tom Dishian, and others who have continued his work, examined 20 years of data accumulated at the Oregon Social Learning Center and demonstrated that poor family management practices in early childhood, this is essentially ineffective parenting, predicted for children in the 3rd grade both academic and peer problems, and that those two challenges predicted in the 9th grade continuing academic problems, but deviant association with deviant peer groups and low parental monitoring, which predicted, in turn, school dropout and juvenile delinquency in high school. To me, this is a particularly important study that I want to highlight because it delineates the multiple pathways in which ineffective parenting early in a child's life at 3 to 5 years of age create distinct related developmental trajectories via academic performance. Academic performance, if not successful, tends to relate to association to peer problems and association with deviant peer groups. But interestingly, despite the fact that in early adolescence, the period of greatest developmental risk in our lifespan, should call for more parental monitoring from parents. Parents who were ineffective in early childhood, not surprisingly, by the teenage years, feel even less empowered to be effective, and so their monitoring is lower than it should be to help overcome these issues. Not only did poor family management skills in early childhood predict dire individual child development outcomes over time, but it also impaired family processes broadly. Interestingly, Gerald Patterson, after marrying a family therapist, I might add, began and having modest effectiveness with his behavior parenting programs, meaning they were taking 18 months or longer to see effects, and even then being effective with only 50% of the population. Expanded his research to look at the broader family system. The results of his research are summarized in his book, Coercive Family Processes, which demonstrated empirically not only the way that coercive parent-child exchanges are established and maintained, but also demonstrated how these spread like wildfire throughout all family relationships. So coercive family processes between one parent and child were found to impact and other children in the family, such that that siblings picked up the same experience and engaged in coercive processes with frequently the mother is the one who gets blamed for everything in this particular case. And not only that, then that siblings would often be the ones to initiate these coercive interactions, which of course then come to the mother's attention and spread. But more importantly, not more importantly, but in addition to this, I was fascinated by the fact that over time, Patterson found that the coercive exchanges between children and their parents, or mothers, primarily, spread to the marital relationship and eventually spread throughout the entire family, such that the family overall were less likely to engage in recreational activities with one another, which of course we think of are kind of like putting the oil in your car, that they help parenting go better when you engage in recreational activities as well. That these families were less likely to go out and engage in the community because nobody wants to be in the community with an out-of-control child. That there were higher rates of maternal depression and lower self-esteem as a result of this. I'm not sure about divorce rates, but we do have a lot of indication that when parents disagree on child rearing, it correlates also with marital dissolution. So you get a sense of the potential impact or cost to society of our ineffective or not intervening with parents in increasing their effectiveness at an early age. So a clear implication of the research I've reviewed so far is that family matters in the academic success of children, and that a second implication would appear to be that intervening with parents to improve their effectiveness should be a high priority of society, and especially at the key developmental stages of infancy, early childhood, and early adolescence. Fortunately, we have a number of effective evidence-based parenting programs that have been well established. They're listed here. There probably are others, but these are the most commonly known ones. They tend to decrease children's behavior problems and parenting stress. They improve parenting skills and self-esteem. They're estimated by the federal government to cost approximately $2,500 per family to administer or provide, but the federal government considers it modest compared to the cost to society of academic failure, risky adolescent behavior, and juvenile delinquency. So given these data, it would seem that I could stop my talk right at this particular point because we have a solution to this problem. Of course, you can imagine that is not what's going to happen yet. So let's look at a closer look at this particular solution of parenting, of training parents to be effective parents, which, please don't misunderstand me. I have no criticism of this. I think this is very important. However, evidence-based parenting programs range from 12 to 20 sessions, require weekly practice and homework completion. The dropout rate tends to be high, generally greater than 50%. Evidence-based parenting programs have largely been established with middle-class white families, not 100%. Initial participation rates are lower, dropout rates higher among multi-problem, ethnically diverse, low-income parents. A particularly concerning fact for me is that 95% of parent training participants are mothers. Back to those mothers again. When a second caregiver does attend, and we don't have a lot of data on this because it's rare, research does find that in follow-up studies, there is improved interpersonal climate in the family compared to customary treatment. But again, this is an area where we need a lot more help and skill in terms of engaging fathers and other caregivers in treatment. So the challenges of parenting programs and program effectiveness are consistent with the limitation of the majority of our research that examines the interrelatedness of child outcomes in family processes. Essentially, we find that most studies and treatments, but most studies measure the perspective of the mother and assume that she is the spokesperson for the family. When we actually look at multiple perspectives, we find that that isn't the case, that fathers tend to have a very different perspective than mothers, and adolescents even a more different perspective than either parent in this case. And it's a little bit unclear how other siblings might contribute to it in terms of research. I promise you that in every family I've ever worked with, if I spoke only with the mother, I saw a very different family if I saw a father or another caregiver. I saw an even different family if I added other siblings. So families definitely, the more members of the household that you can include in the intervention, the different your perspective will be about this child and the concerns they have. But going back to my point, parenting does not occur in a vacuum. It occurs in a matrix of social support. A particularly salient relationship in the literature regarding parenting and support comes from the marital relationship. In 1984, Belsky, so we're going to turn to the issue of the relationship, the interaction between the marital relationship quality and parenting quality, parent-child relationship. In 1984, Belsky proposed that the marital relationship exerts an effect on child outcomes, primarily through marital quality and parenting. So that's your mediated indirect model below. But recent research finds instead that the effects of the marital relationship on children are both direct, as you see on the top arrow, or indirect, mediated through parenting behaviors and the parent-child relationship. Consistent with what I've said before, positive parent-child relations are less likely to exist when the marital relationship is troubled. Marital conflict is particularly deleterious to children and has a spillover effect on the parent-child relationship. Marital conflict is associated with increased negativity of fathers with their children after an argument and decreased engagement with children by both mothers and fathers. National samples find that children are close to both parents when marriages are happy. Children tend to be close to only one parent or neither parent when marriages are unhappy. This effect continues through the period that children leave school and the rest of their life, leave home and continues through the rest of adulthood. Overall, chronic marital conflict is associated with decreased parent involvement and presence in the lives of their children over the time that children live at home, and as I said, continues beyond that. In terms of the direct effects, marital conflict has been found to elicit negative, aggressive behaviors in children, both boys and girls, which appears in subsequent mother-child interactions and peer interactions, not consistently in sibling interactions. John Gottman, another one of my research heroes, in a longitudinal study, found that children also model and adopt the conflict resolution style that they see their parents exhibiting or not exhibiting in their subsequent peer relations. So he found that the mutually hostile pattern of parent interaction, which of course is high conflict, correlates with later marital disillusion, predicted externalizing behavior patterns in children 3 years later, as well as their behavior with peers. The husband angry and withdrawn pattern of marital conflict predicted child internalizing behavior patterns 3 years later, and similarly had an impact on children's play with their peers. In another study, Gottman demonstrated that marital discord affected not only children's peer relations and style of play, but also their physical health through indirect and direct pathways. He put it this way, I'm going to quote, "Maritally distressed and physiologically under-aroused couples have a parenting style that is cold, unresponsive, angry, and low in limit setting and structuring, and this interaction style relates to anger and non-compliance in their children, as well as high levels of stress-related hormones. Children from such homes tend to play at lower level with peers, display more negative interactions, and have worse health. The direct pathway through the model shows that maritally distressed couples have children who are under a high level of chronic stress, as indexed by their high level of urinary catecholamines, which is related to their propensity for maintaining low, potentially conflict-free levels of play with their friends." Before going on, I'd like to point out, so clearly from my perspective, this research indicates that the marital relationship has a profound impact on the quality of the parent-child relationship and the ability of parents to parent well, whether they know how to parent well or not, but we're talking about emotional stress and its compromise on our health and our mental health. This research did not indicate whether these data represent first marriages or remarriages. I want to generalize briefly to the fact that there is considerable data that shows that remarriage, which generally occurs within 3 years of a divorce, has a higher rate of marital dissolution than first marriages. And we can assume then is correlated with unhappy marriages or marital discord that children then experience again in a relatively short period of time. To be specific, whereas 50% of initial marriages end in divorce, approximately 2/3 of remarriages end in divorce. One solution to this alarming statistically is to avoid the commitment of marriage altogether. And we find that demographically, we have, not surprisingly, an increase in rates of cohabitation rather than marriage, including among single parents with children. So what is the effect of this relationship on children? Although the research in this area, because the demographic trend is relatively new compared to the many years that we've studied the effects of divorce and to a lesser extent remarriage, the research is not good in terms of the outcomes for children. That cohabitation, not per se a bad thing, but the instability of commitment that tends to go with cohabitation rather than marriage tends to have adverse effects or consequences for children. It obviously puts a great deal more stress on the biological parent-child relationship, but even increases more the importance of that cohabiting relationship being supportive of the parent-child relationship over time in terms of the well-being of children. So to bring this part of the talk somewhat to a close, the authors that completed a meta-analysis on the marital data concluded that troubled child relationships and troubled parent-child relationships may best be aided through efforts to address parental marital difficulties and strengthen the skills needed to prevent difficulties from becoming profound and irreconcilable. Family psychologists would agree with this statement because they view child problems as embedded within a larger matrix of social relationships. Family systems treatment involves systematically improving all relevant relationships in the family. And by relevant, I mean meaning they're relevant to the problem that the child appears to be having. Fortunately, just as with parenting, we have evidence-based family systems therapies as well. They're listed up here. You can even tell by the titles that Many of them, such as multisystemic, multidimensional, functional, largely focus on multiple systems, including the interaction of the family with other systems. Among these, the first 4 are primarily focused on families with adolescents. It's interesting that, in general, treatment for younger children focuses on, our evidence-based focuses on parenting programs. In adolescents, the evidence-based focuses on families with adolescent populations. Most of them focus on externalizing problems, the first 4. This is primarily because our evidence base for these was thanks to the federal government and SAMHSA's belief for a period of time that families contributed greatly to adolescents' use of substance abuse. So thank you, federal government. Attachment-based therapy is demonstrated as effective, or in the process of becoming demonstrated as evidence-based for internalizing disorders among adolescents. The family checkup is, I added it at the end because it has a strong evidence-based. It's a slightly different, it's more of a motivational and engagement intervention to help families get into whatever the next phase of treatment is. And we know that motivating families to come to treatment is a big deal. So that's of help. And it's school-based, which is another one. So, in summary, parent and parent-child relationships and child outcomes do not exist in a vacuum. Stable, loving adult, close relationships provide critical emotional support to children that's necessary for their success in school. And harmful or conflictual family relationships create negative outcomes for children that significantly impair their development, and the effects carry over to adulthood. Nothing in my mind could illustrate this better than the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study. I know all of you are familiar, most of you are familiar with this. I hope you forgive me for repeating it because I think it's just the most remarkable data that and is so helpful to us in understanding the impact of relationships, of social relationships on our health and well-being. For those of you who may be less familiar with it, the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study was a large-scale study completed by Kaiser Permanente in partnership with the CDC, where over 17,000 of the Kaiser Permanente patients were voluntarily given the option to complete a checklist on there indicating whether they'd experienced these adverse childhood experiences, which were largely collected from the literature. My primary regret about this is it doesn't include remarriage, which we know has some negative effects on children as well, or can be an adverse experience. That aside, it's incredibly rich data, or data that we are unable to get typically. But there are limitations to this sample, understandably. Even large is not one of them. It has a great sample. But the sample is also, and it's 50% female, so that's a good thing. But 75% of the sample was white. A similar percentage had attended college. All had jobs and good health care. So this is not your at-risk sample, right? This is your kind of everyday middle America sample, largely, except that it was mostly in California. So we could question about whether that, how generalizable that is, I guess. So individuals indicated the degree to which they had experienced any of these adverse childhood experiences. One of the first findings was that adverse childhood experiences are common. 2/3 of individuals reported at least one of these. Another finding was that specifically maltreatment and household dysfunction, which is really what I've been talking about this whole time, which was reported by approximately 1/3 of the participants, contributed to chronic diseases decades later in life, such that children who'd experienced maltreatment and household dysfunction were more likely over time to develop heart disease, cancer, stroke, and diabetes. all of which are some of the most common causes of death and disabilities in the United States. This study also found that adverse childhood experiences often co-occur. 87% of individuals who reported one reported another, and 12.5% of the population reported 4 or more. Adverse childhood experiences have a dose-response relationship. Having 4 adverse childhood experiences was associated with a 700% increase in alcoholism, a doubling of the risk to be diagnosed with cancer, a 4-fold increase in emphysema, and if you had 6 ACE, a score of 6 ACE, childhood adverse events, you were associated with a 3,000% increase in attempted suicide. I don't know about the rest of you, but for me, it never occurred to me that the things that happened in my childhood could possibly impact my health 30, 40, 50 years later. So to me, the ACEs study has been really helpful in highlighting the multiple ways in which our family experiences matter to us. This is an example of the basic process, the pyramid or the process by which the ACEs study assumes that these processes occur over the lifespan. To me, what the ACEs studies also links with, though, is one of the more exciting efforts going on in research, in practice, in the family psychology area, couple and family psychology area. And that's the neurobiology of family relationships, which this really represents. The neurobiology of family relationships really looks at the recursive processes between the brain, the body, and our close social relationships, or not so close relationships, but in this case I'm focused on our close relationships. And it clearly, psychoimmunology clearly demonstrates that positive family relationships are associated with better physical and mental health, and greater longevity. Unhappy family relationships are associated with poorer health and with higher mortality. How does this occur? The pathways for the health and relationship connection include the immune system and inflammatory processes. Stressful relationships, chronic stress, creates chronic inflammation within our body that deteriorates our health over time. In this talk, I've attempted to illustrate this primarily as it relates to children. However, this process has also been well documented as an outcome of couple and marital interactions as well. In addition, the adverse consequences of having no close, intimate relations as an adult over time. In summary, hopefully I have convinced you that family matters in the lives of children and adults. Whereas supportive family relationships can promote resilience and ameliorate individual, adult, and childhood stress, dysfunctional family processes create increased risk via chronic stress that interferes with the cognitive processes essential to academic and job performance, reduces immune functioning essential to health, creates chronic inflammation within the body that then damages our health far beyond its normal wear and tear over time. From where I sit, this represents a national crisis or emergency that is far greater than immigration and the border wall. However, we are not devoting significant resources to family research or to developing evidence-based family interventions, in my view. I appreciate that this is a really complicated process. An example of a family genogram to sort of highlight even that of course came off the web and is not some actual person, but just sort of highlights the complexity of the family that most family psychologists would look at when looking at a family and trying to evaluate the various relationships. This complexity makes research more difficult. Who do you measure? At what point in their development do you measure it? How roles are not equivalent in terms of mothers in biological mothers and intact families are not equivalent to mothers, to stepmothers or single parent mothers. Each of these family structural differences engage different family processes. Families are not comparable across different points in the developmental lifespan, and certainly families are very affected and vary considerably by culture and background. So all of this makes research with families tricky and complicated, and and really requires the assistance and the help of ingenious quantitative methods, folks, to help us create useful research designs and data analytic skills that help do that. Similarly, it's very difficult to engage families in treatment. It's difficult enough to engage just fathers in parent training, so if you're talking about bringing additional family members in, that can be even more challenging. So in no way do I wish to undermine the challenges that occur, and there certainly is inadequate research to indicate that working in that particular way is more effective at this particular time. That clearly has to have a cost benefit that would make it worth doing from the get-go. However, despite the challenges, I do think that our most recent neurobiological and longitudinal research suggests that our closest caregiving relationships, parent-child and marital or equivalent, are critical to our health and survival. So I would argue that it's imperative that we refocus our attention on these relationships, studying them, understanding them, and finding effective ways to intervene with them for the well-being of our children and our society. We need regulations that we need to be able to help people understand how to create relationships with one another that soothe our nervous systems and model for our children the behavior that this planet is so much in need of. I was invited to give this talk because in August of this past year, I received the Family Psychologist of the Year award from the Society for Couple and Family Psychology, which for me would be one of those kind of Oscar-like experiences. It was given to me for my sustained distinguished contribution to the specialty. I've listed some books up there which are not what I consider the sum total of my contribution, but sort of share some of the areas that I've been interested in. I am deeply appreciative of the opportunity to speak to all of you and appreciate your attention to this topic. I wish to thank my mother, my father, my daughter, my 3 grandchildren, and my beloved partner, Matthew Snap, for teaching me every day about family relationships. Thank you. Questions? Comments?
I have a question. So thank you so much for this talk and for all your great work in this area. Wondering if in modern times when very young children spend so much time in childcare, you would extend the family system to include childcare providers, and how that complicates your thinking, given that those are very often highly stressed single mothers themselves. Just curious your thoughts on that.
Sure. Thank you for the question. As a systems person, I obviously think that all systems that have any engagement with the child and are in language about the child should be included in intervention and in helping a child succeed. So the answer to your question would be yes, I would do that. I've often thought we should have family-oriented practicums in early childhood education as well, settings as well. I think it's a really critical time, a great time to offer parent training and possibly utilizing those daycare centers where there are caregivers that children trust and are accustomed to, and I know they sometimes provide family nights out or parent nights out, but maybe they could provide parent training and then parent nights out or something like that. So so yes, I think that it's really important to use every possible support and to help parents and children's caregivers be on the same page with regard to children's functioning. My overall experience has been the more people you include in the solution, the better it is in terms of families. So that's probably true for many things, but it seems especially true with children's problems and families. And yet that makes getting those people together is a challenge. But I think in the end, it seems to, it's always surprising to me where the solution will come from in those groups. It's almost never the person you would expect to have the solution. So, yeah.
Thank you. You mentioned also the emphasis on mothers as being considered the target of the problem. And I'm wondering if you've seen over the years an increase in father participation or intervention specifically designed for fathers, and then also an increase in participation as, you know, over the past decade, fathers have been more involved and sometimes being the ones who stay home and watch kids.
I definitely think there's an increase in fathers' involvement with their children. And I would not say that I have read all of the literature on this. I have not seen a concomitant increase in research on fathers. I still think that's being viewed as low incidence in the research. I still think that there is less father involvement in parent training than would be ideal. I wish Dr. Erin Rockland were here to talk to us about that. I mean, I really think there's something different about the way in which interventions that involve fathers or engagement processes need to occur. I don't feel like I'm expert on that, but I think it's disappointingly low considering the emphasis that's been placed on it, or the openness, or even the changing egalitarian relationships between mothers and fathers in families. So I do think fathers do much more. I don't see them coming to treatment as often as would be ideal. Yeah.
Yeah, given that you won the Academy Award in the child in the family psychology, I'm wondering what your thoughts are about increasing the training in family therapy, because I actually have seen that training's gone down in disciplines across my lifetime, because I was trained as a family therapist, as you know, but just seeing that people put less emphasis on it, after the managed behavioral health care came in, and the emphasis on the CBT training, and nothing wrong with that. It's certainly in the family therapy too, but I'm wondering, what your ideas are about how we can revive that.
Oh, that's also a good question. I mean, we certainly, as someone who's been committed to that, and I probably had it in my talk and took it out, was, my sadness about that. I thought, that's a little self-focused. So, but I would love to see students have more direct experience in working with families, if for no other reason than I think it then changes the way students work for the rest of their life, whether they do family therapy or not. At least that's what my students have told me. I mean, students who had that experience with me, and even in my own teaching, I've let go of the direct practicum training of students to do that, and which also is, I suppose it's like, you feel the loss for all those pieces that kind of go by the wayside. Having fond memories of having spent hours and hours with students behind the one-way mirrors to work with families. So, but I do think that's what it takes. It takes that level of time and commitment to create that experience. I think it's hard. I think it's costly. I think it changes lives. So I'd recommend it, but it's costly. It's hard. We don't seem to be in an era where doing what is not cost effective is very easily supported. I would assume at some point that will catch up with us, but for right now, I also think family therapy techniques and models are, working hard to make changes, and there may be more adaptive models for contemporary, our contemporary experience, and I'm very appreciative of the people who are working in those areas. So, thank you for your wonderful questions. I think that's it. Thank you so much for your attention.